Hello, Humanities 1302. I hope everybody is doing well. But, anyways, today the topic that we're going to be addressing in our lecture is going to be that of society in America during the 1800s. Now, we are beginning a new unit, and we're really going to be talking about today American society prior to the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War. And as we get into next week, see how this is going to influence a lot of soldiers out on the battlefield within that conflict. But, anyways, we're going to be talking about what society looks like, looking at American ideals, looking at the developing class structures in the US during the 1800s, and talk about how that will contribute to the human experience within the US Civil War. Now, on top of describing American society during the 1800s, we're also going to be talking about literary as well as religious movements that occurred during this period as well. And once again, we'll see how these movements are going to help contribute to one, the outbreak of the Civil War, but also how they're going to impact the American mindset and attitudes as we get to that period. And one other topic that I will be addressing within this lecture is also the idea of military service, because we'll see for those roughly 3 million Americans that would serve in either army during the US Civil War, military service during this antebellum period, a lot of what we're talking about today, would be drastically different than the service they would talk about in regards to their personal service during the Civil War. So we're going to be focusing on a little bit of the soldiers' experience during this period as well. But anyways, as we begin today, and I actually skipped over the introduction slide, but anyways, you can view that on D2L. But anyways, to begin today, I wanted to talk about America in the 1800s. Really to kind of take a look at where American society was at, what most Americans would be doing during this period, and so forth. Now, America in the early 1800s, and I'm really today going to be collectively talking about the first half of the 1800s. It looks drastically different than the US we're familiar with today. First, American society, I mean, it was quite a bit different economically. The grand majority of Americans were farmers, living whether it be in a plantation, if we talk about it in the South, or whether it's a farm in the North, and so forth. They would have fallen into a class of farmers that Thomas Jefferson would have dubbed as the yeoman farmers, basically self sufficient and really unimpacted by the outside world. Also, in regards to the US during the 1800s, where we see it was heavily agrarian, unlike what we see today, it was by no means the same power that we're familiar with today. Well, we need to understand, even building up to the US Civil War, the US was not considered a world class power. Even after the US Civil War, the US would be considered this by the various European nations. It was a new republic. Many European nations still believed at some point this republic would fail, even though once we get to the Civil War, it's been almost 87 odd years since the American Revolution. So, in regards to America's status abroad, it was not quite the same as what we'd see today. Americans were really more concerned with internal issues. They really didn't have major concerns with what was happening overseas. And we're not going to talk about this in class, but you do see this in the build up to World War I as well as World War II as well. America wanted to remain in what's called an isolationist state, really be involved in affairs just in the US and to a lesser extent in the Western Hemisphere, meaning the Americas. So America wasn't really concerned with foreign issues. And we're going to talk about some of the domestic issues that they will be concerned with today, especially the issue of westward expansion. Because even though America wasn't the same nation that we see as today, it was expanding. And we'll talk about that in regards to the West a little bit later on. Now, in regards to America's governmental system, while it does have the basic structure to what we see today, with a president, with a vice president, with a or both houses of Congress, and so forth, the American governmental system looks drastically different than anything that we're familiar with. First, at the beginning of the 1800s, democracy in particular, and how individuals elect officials would look drastically different. If we go to senators, for example, the American people didn't vote for senators into office. They voted for the state legislatures that then selected their senators. So we see democracy limited there. In regards to who can vote, democracy was greatly limited. Back during the early 1800s, at the outset of the century, really the only way that you could vote in elections is you had to be in many states, you had to be an individual of wealth. You had to own a certain amount of land in order to participate in politics in this fashion. And you see this in the case, especially of southern states like Virginia as well as South Carolina. However, during the 1800s, we will start to see that this process begins to change, and this will greatly impact Americans into the foreseeable future and somewhat impact the events that we'll be talking about in the build up to the Civil War. Now, individual rights will begin to expand more drastically within the US than what we'd see over, at least initially, in other European countries. And this will largely be because of both Thomas Jefferson as well as Andrew Jackson, who both want to extend suffrage. Now, in the build up to the Civil War, really an idea that I promote in my history 1301 classes, where I talk more extensively about this issue, is the idea of Jacksonian democracy. That's where we see American democracy begin to be expanded to all white males, regardless of class. Class really doesn't become an issue in regards to voting. As I mentioned before, some of those laws that limited individuals to voting only if they have a certain amount of land and so forth were beginning to be raised by the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and so forth. And that's going to be important because that's going to greatly impact the electorate and how America's government will function in the foreseeable future. But I do want to point out, while Jacksonian democracy, as well as the democratic trends that we see develop after Thomas Jefferson prior to him, while we do see them expanding democracy, or at least vocally expressing they want to expand democracy, there are limitations to this. Because I do want to point out with Jacksonian democracy in particular, as I mentioned a second ago, it's only expanding the right to vote to all white males. It's not expanding the right to vote to women. It's not expanding the right to vote for African Americans or any other minority group. But anyways, that's roughly the state of the US that we see at the beginning of the 1800s. It was just beginning to become more inclusive with an expansion of democracy, but the nation still was very different than what we'd see today, especially in regards to the makeup of the economy. Now, there will be one singular event, and I hate to say this just because really, when we talk about turning points and say history, that can be a little bit redundant. But there will be one single event that will greatly change American society as I've just described, more so in regards to the economic front. And it'll be that of the War of 1812. Now, prior to the War of 1812, at the beginning of the century, how most Americans first, how they viewed one another, is they didn't view one another uh, as Americans. If you were living in Virginia, you would have referred to yourself as a Virginian. If you were living in South Carolina, you were a South Carolinian, and so on and so forth. To individuals living in America in the early 1800s, their nation was their state. And really, this is how many Americans viewed American society, really, for the better portion of the early years of the Republic. But the War of 1812 will begin to change that. And it's also going to begin to change the U.S. economy. Now, this image that we see here on the board, this is an engraving, and this is where I want to talk about briefly artwork that gets produced in the US. Um, During this period, in regards to art, America won't be well known for its artwork. As I mentioned before, it was viewed as or I shouldn't say it wasn't viewed as an emerging world power yet. But anyways, it was viewed as a second-class power to the other European nations. And they make this argument, Europeans in particular, because of one, where America is located, because it was a up and coming republic, since it didn't have many of the same cultural traditions as what you'd see over in Europe. And also, part of these arguments, they would say that America didn't really have a true literary artistic tradition. Now, in regards to artwork, we're not going to be focusing so much on actual artwork being produced by artists, similar to what we had talked about with, say, David during the French Revolution and so forth. But what Americans will be very familiar with in terms of their art will be these engravings. Now, throughout this period, a number of these engravings would be produced, whether it's of this image that recreates the American fight for independence, or if it's depicting some of the other contemporary events. And also, these pieces of artwork could be used as propaganda, especially with glorifying, in this case, the American cause at the end of the War of 1812. And this gives us a good insight to the societies at these moments when these engravings are being produced. Now, in regards to this image, America Guided by Wisdom, it's produced at the end of the War of 1812. Now, I usually talk about the War of 1812 for an hour and a half, but I'm not going to do that here. But really quickly, what happens in the War of 1812, America wasn't respected really as a world power. The British begin to seize much of American shipping, regardless of America's complaints. Eventually, the U.S., to make a long story short, after seeing these rights as well as rights out on the frontier being violated by the British, declare war against Great Britain, and for the course of the next 3 years in the War of 1812, the U.S. would combat Great Britain. Now, at points, the U.S. will do well in this conflict, at points, they will do pretty poorly. And the war essentially ends in a draw. However, for Americans, this would be proved to be a moral victory. The reason being is because we have to understand that taking on Great Britain, really the powerhouse of the world, the power that had just defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, as well as the year prior to that in 1814, America just fought them to a draw. Think of that moral victory that Americans would have thought of. I mean, they didn't have really a long-standing military tradition like the British. They didn't have the same resources, supplies, and so forth. And so, for many Americans, they would view the conflict as a military victory, even though effectively it was a draw. And why that's important is because that's going to impact the American psyche. For the first time, Americans will proudly present themselves as Americans. No longer would they be divided along their state interests. You would see that they would identify as Americans. And this was because a great amount of patriotism, as we see represented in this America Guided by Wisdom image, was being promoted as a result of America's quote unquote victory in the War of 1812. And with this nationalist pride that begins to envelop the United States by this period, this is where we'll see the War of 1812. The consequences of this conflict are going to impact us all the way up to the U.S. Civil War. And it's largely going to have to do with what occurs in the economy. Now, following the end of the War of 1812, briefly, once again, I could talk about this for another 2 hours, but I'm going to save that topic for my U.S. history classes. Following the end of the War of 1812, just to state it briefly, the Madison administration, James Madison was the president at the time, saw that the U.S., one, had been completely ill prepared for the conflict, and the war could have gone drastically against the U.S. And it was because of several reasons. First, the nation's infrastructure was in deplorable condition. When you're having armies march all over the continental United States, it's important to have well constructed roads, canals, well functioning waterways, and so forth. And so he sees the necessity for building up the nation's infrastructure. And I also want to point out why he sees the nation needs to build it up. I mean, the U.S. Capitol was almost undefended during the war and got burned to the ground. So that also contributed as well. But he would call for the nation to build up all those items I mentioned: roads, waterways, and so forth. Furthermore, what we'd also see is because of the experience in the war, James Madison, he understood the importance of having a centralized bank, especially in helping funding the war, but also in protecting America's interest. And this is where we'll see the establishment of a second bank of the United States. And I'm not going to go into the history behind the second bank of the United States, but this would enable the U.S. to begin to really have a centralized banking system that would help grow it commercially. And then lastly, also helping it grow commercially, which I should point out, infrastructure is a part of this as well. He sees the necessity to pass a tariff. Now, during the War of 1812, the roughly decade surrounding this period from we're going to say 1806 to 1815, the U.S. had been in uh, they had been in almost warlike conditions against Great Britain throughout much of this period. Now, they don't formally declare war until 1812. However, because of the seizure of American ships, the U.S. Decides to pass an embargo act to stop trading with the outside world, namely with Great Britain. And why that's important is because prior to this, America commercially had been very dependent on Great Britain. They relied on British commerce to bring in a number of finished products that were manufactured back over in Britain, not in the US, over to American markets. However, with a decade period where you're not trading with that power that provided you with things like clothes, cloths, and so forth, you have to become economically independent. And as a result, America witnessed the rise of its commercial sector, the rise of particularly manufacturing. And when the war comes to an end, when you reintroduce those British products, there's a possibility that America could lose that sector that was beginning to grow and really could prove to be the foundation for a very well versed and well respected American nation. And so, to protect American interests, to protect American manufacturing, James Madison would also adopt a tariff that year. And all of those things coupled together are going to spark a phenomenon, in particular the buildup of the nation's infrastructure, an event known as the market revolution that's really going to set the course for us on our road to the Civil War. Now, what the market revolution does is it revolutionizes America's market system. Now America would not be really a nation based off of the back of yeoman self-sufficient farmers that had really any knowledge of what was happening in the outside world. I shouldn't put it like that, really have any interactions with the outside world, but rather they would become dependent on commercial agriculture, on commercial manufacturing, and so forth. And the US, by the beginning of the Civil War, would be viewed as an emerging world power because of the market revolution. Now, just to kind of understand the significance and how it impacts average Americans' lives and leads them from being predominantly yeoman farmers to eventually either commercial farmers or wage earners working in factories, I want to take an example I use for my History 1301 classes in regards to a tomato farm. Now, the reason that we see a lot of yeoman farmers in the USA during the 18th century prior to this period is, let's say if you're producing a crop like tomatoes. Well, if you want to sell your tomatoes and make a profit, you have to have good roads. You don't obviously want your tomato to spoil because obviously, if it spoils before it gets to its destination, you lose money, you don't make money, and so forth. And so, because there wasn't very good road systems, because transportation was painstakingly slow, it took about a week to travel from New York to Boston, which today would take you less than just a couple of hours. But, anyways, it took 7 days during this period. And so, think about it. You, as a tomato farmer, you're not willing to trade with any other markets because of how difficult it was to travel. But during this period, when we see the buildup of roads, when we see the buildup of turnpikes, when we see the buildup of the Erie Canal, for example, or other canal systems across the US, when you start to see, as we see in this image, the introduction of steamboats, which I do want to point out, innovation is going to help fuel this period as well. And we'll talk about the steam engine here more in a second. When you see the introduction of steamboats, when you when you see the introduction of railroads, transportation's much quicker, it's much cheaper. Now, you as a tomato farmer, you don't have to just sell your tomatoes just to your neighbors. You can sell them to the city next to your city. You could sell them to another state, and so on and so forth. And so that's what's going to revolutionize the economy. Now, for some of these industries that we'll talk about here in a second, as they grow and as railroads in particular grow, they're going to have more markets that they can effectively reach out to. And so this is going to impact the very way of life for Americans, especially once we see the introduction of the railway by the 1830s and the 1840s. But, anyways, this market revolution is going to help diversify the US economy. Now, also contributing to the market revolution, I did mention a moment ago, innovation will be crucial. You will start to see the introduction of mechanized devices that would make, say, transportation much quicker. The steam engine gets introduced to the US during this period, and it will really be a byproduct of what had been produced over in England in the 1770s. But it'll arrive over in the US, it would be applied to steamboats, and you'd see, I can't remember the exact figure, but well over 700 steamboats going across America's waterways. And why that's so significant for average Americans, because now if they're wanting to engage in the commercial economy, especially in regards to the Mississippi River or other rivers. And I want to point out rivers are very important to Americans because they were the highways of their time. Traditionally, before these steamboats, you could only go downriver. You could only float with the current. But now you could go up and downriver. You could fight against the current, trade with a number of new markets, in other words. And that's going to transform how Americans live as well. You'll also see other mechanized devices, which I have on the next slide, the cotton gin in particular. This is going to specifically revolutionize the Southern economy. It's going to make it easy for you to produce cotton crop, taking the seed fibers out of the cotton in a method that would be 50 times faster than doing it by hand. And as a result of this, fortunes are going to be made, new products are going to be produced in larger numbers, and mass production is going to become commonplace. And this is where I want to take the cotton gin, for example, because this is something that we still see today. Cotton cloths, cotton clothes, widely popular not only amongst Americans but amongst Europeans. But cotton, it was very hard to produce before we see the introduction of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in the 1790s. You couldn't produce a whole lot of it, and when you can't mass produce a good, the price is a lot higher, especially if it's a desirable commodity. But now that you can mass produce these goods, say with the cotton gin, the price begins to be driven down significantly. Average consumers can now purchase it, and this opens up once again more markets, and that's how it's going to revolutionize American lives. And I want to point out cotton will be crucial to the overall American economy. You will see it produced in the South. It will then be transported to northern textile mills, to those manufacturing plants as a result, and really help fuel American capitalism. It's also going to help fuel world trade because we'll see, especially over in England, they would be producing those crops, or not producing those crops, taking that cotton, producing it over into clothes and textile mills, and selling it to various European countries as well as countries around the world. And so, cotton will be very vital to the world economy. And we'll talk more about it a little bit later on, but it was because of the fact that we see new inventions come into being to why we see really the market revolution begin to take off, to where we see the US economy begin to diversify, expand, and America looks like it's emerging manufacturing as well as commercial power. However, with the market revolution, one of its major consequences is going to be the rise of sectionalism. Now, I talked about after the War of 1812, really for the first probably 10 or so years, decade after the end of the War of 1812, you will see that Americans were fueled by patriotism. They were fueled by this new sense of nationalism. But that begins to give way by the end of the 1820s, the beginning of the 1830s, when we start to see sectionalism begin to develop, to where you see the northern and southern societies and cultures begin to diverge a little bit. And a lot of it will be based around their economies. Now, much of this industrialization, the buildup of American manufacturing as well as industry, does take place in the North. And significantly, when you see the establishment of things like the Erie Canal, this will greatly and positively impact the Northern economy. However, the Southern economy, with especially with the invention of the cotton gin, it would become ever more reliable on agriculture as opposed to commerce. It would take a much different pathway. And we'll talk about how that will impact Southern society a little bit later on. But just through these economies that we're beginning to go off in these two different directions, you start to see these fractures develop along sectional lines. And you see the early seeds through the market revolution begin to develop that would eventually lead us to civil war. And this is where now I want to talk about those different societies, the different economies that come out of those societies as a result. Now, this won't be the case for y'all, but I'm going to go ahead and pause this video really quick just to darken up those the wordage there. All right, folks. So I apologize about that short little kind of delay. But anyways, now I want to take a look at the differing economies and societies that begin to develop as a result of the market revolution. So we already talked about the drastically different pathways that both the northern and southern economies begin to go down. Now I want to talk about how it will impact their societies in very different ways, because you'll see that the class structures, which will play a very important role ultimately into the culture that we'll see in both sections of the nation, they begin to develop in very particular ways. Now, Southern society in particular is going to be more akin, if you will, to the old feudalistic society that was dominated by class, privilege, and so forth, like what we'd seen over in Europe. But Southern society will look drastically different than the aristocratic dominated society we talked over in Europe as well. Now, Southern society, it's going to be dominated by agriculture, and it's largely going to be centered around, or I should say its economy, will be centered around the production of cash crops. Now, this has been the case for Southern society ever since the founding of the original 13 colonies, but we see with the invention of the cotton gin, more so cash crops become ever more crucial to the Southern economy. Now, in regards to Southern society, you really can divide up into these five basic classes that I've listed here. Now, first we're going to start with the plantation owners. Even though King Cotton, as it became known as, was generating large fortunes for much of the South and making individuals particularly rich, this wealth won't be evenly distributed. Only about 3% of the population will actually be these plantation owners that we see living in the South during this period. Overwhelmingly, they're going to control much of the wealth of the South. I don't remember the exact figure, but it's well over 50% of the GDP that you see in the South. On top of that, when we talk about the slaves of the South, and we'll talk about slavery here more particularly and how it impacts those individuals, the plantation owners are going to own the grand majority of the slaves. We'll see that they're going to have the plantations, and really those that fall into this class would own at least 20 or more slaves. Okay. But anyways, they will also gain much of the land that we see in the South. And land was particularly vital to social standing because the more land you have, the richer you were, the more crops you could produce, and so forth. and how they also impact all these other classes that we see below them is they're going to choose the best land and really the leftover lands that you couldn't produce, whether it's cotton, tobacco, or another cash crop, is going to be left to some of these lower classes. But anyways, they are also going to dominate politics. Much of the policies that would be promoted during this period, even when we won't talk too much about the secession crisis in this class, when you start to see the various southern states begin to leave the union, most of their representatives are going to be these large plantation owners. And when you talk about class, I mean, even doing my own research when I wrote my thesis, I read a set of documents about ex-Confederate soldiers talking about their lives prior to the Civil War. Many of these Confederate veterans, many of them documented that there were prevalent class issues, that plantation owners often looked down upon them. They looked at them in a very negative light, regardless if they were in this middling farmers class, poor whites, and so forth. And so tensions were relatively hot. And to quote one of these ex-Confederates, he would state that in elections, and this was actually one of the questions that was asked in this questionnaire, is whether or not slave owners had more power in elections. In terms of elections, for every slave one individual owned, they had essentially more support. I mean, to quote him directly, basically said for every slave they had one vote, but that's not the case. They wouldn't get a vote for a slave. But anyways, because they had the wealth, they had also the power to dominate politics. And at those secession conventions, specifically, I always talk about my 1301 classes, the plantation owners, they're going to dominate the South Carolina secession convention. And whether or not there's a possibility South Carolina secedes if you have mostly these lower classes representing there, it begs to that question begs to be answered. However, nonetheless, it demonstrates to us how the plantation owners do dominate these um, these elections. Now, below them, this class you really could couple with the plantation owners. These are going to be your overseers. These are going to be really the individuals that are going to help run the daily operations of the plantation owners. They're going to oversee the slaves. They themselves will own their own slaves, and they will be viewed in a very high regard in regards to Southern society. Now, I do want to point out these other two classes that we see between the top two. Really, plantation owners, overseers, they may perhaps make up as many as 10 to 15% of all Southerners. However, the grand majority of Southerners, or I should say white Southerners, are going to fall into these two classes that we see below. Middling farmers, this is really a class that we could argue is like a middle class for the farmers that we see in the South. They're going to own their own land. They're going to produce their own incomes, whether it's from a cash crop or from produce, whatever the case, whatever the case is. However, in regards to the middling farmers, they make up the bulk of the population. And many of them, if not most of them, aren't going to own a single slave. This is a figure that I often point out, but it's important for us to recognize that at the beginning of the Civil War, only 25% of white Southerners own a single slave, or own at least a single slave. And so the other 75% of white farmers, whether they fall into this middling farmers class or the poor whites class, they're going to not own a single slave. And this does raise a very interesting question that I'll address here in a second. But if 75% of Southerners don't own a slave, why would they support the institution of slavery once we get to the U.S. Civil War? And I do make that argument. I'll talk more about that in the future. But anyways, that's really your middling class. These are going to be your average farmers, have their own land. They could be yeoman farmers. They could be self-sufficient. They're producing their own cotton crop. But they view as the ideal and the pinnacle of their society is becoming one day one of these plantation owners. Underneath the middling farmers, you have a class known as the poor whites. Typically, these are going to be individuals that don't have any land. They would rent out portions of land from white plantation owners, work for them. And interestingly, you will see that many of these poor whites would be working side by side with slaves that we see at the bottom of the social order on many plantations. And there's a great possibility because of class issues that you might actually see poor whites and slaves have a common cause to rally behind. However, ultimately, in the end, as I mentioned a moment ago, most of these middling farmers, poor whites, they're going to support the same political ideals as the plantation owners, support the idea of slavery. If you look overwhelmingly from the South, especially with the expansion of Jacksonian democracy, these two lower classes of middling farmers and poor whites overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party, which becomes the party of slavery building up to the Civil War. And the question is, why do they have such a vestige interest in slavery? Why would they fight so dramatically for slavery during the US Civil War when many of them don't own a single slave? Well, it's not necessarily the direct reasons of owning a slave to why they would fight to preserve that institution. It was the idea of what the abolition of slavery would mean. Now, first, I do want to go back to the point I mentioned a moment ago. For many Southerners, and this will be, especially when I think of Confederate generals, this would be the case of, say, Albert Sidney Johnston, who's actually or I don't want to say native of Texas, but actually was one of a part of that founding generation of Texans. They viewed as the pinnacle of society as becoming a rich plantation owner. That was essentially the American dream during this period. If you acquired slaves, if you acquired your own plantation, you had achieved the pinnacle of society. You had achieved a great amount of wealth. And so that idea is going to motivate them. And they understood that with the abolition of slavery, it could destroy that. But more importantly, and this is going to be more of the driving force to why they will support the issue of slavery in these various elections, it's because we have to remember Southern society. There's about 9 million or so people living in the American South at the outbreak of the Civil War. Of that 9 million, 4 million are in bondage. 4 million roughly fall into this final class that we see at the bottom of the social order, slaves. And I'll talk about free blacks in the South here in a second. Why does that matter? Well, it's because if you were to free 4 million individuals, trying to understand it from the perspective of these two classes, middling farmers and poor whites, this creates competition. It creates competition for jobs. It creates competition for land, as well as other issues regarding competition. And so this would disrupt their lives as they know it. So if you're one of these middling farmers in particular, I'm going to point them out. You could lose some of your land in the process. Land prices could go up. There could be a whole thing, a whole lot of issues that could resort as a result of the end of slavery. So directly or indirectly, you will see that most Southern whites will fight to preserve the institution of slavery by the time of the Civil War because they understood it would greatly change how they live within their societies. That's the reason. It's not necessarily because they have a direct reason because they own a slave. It will be because of indirectly, it will impact their lives in a very dramatic way. All right. And we'll talk more about their motivations of Southern soldiers once we get to the war. And we'll talk more about it is a little more complicated than that as well for other Southern soldiers. But for the majority, for the grand majority, that will be why. Now, at the bottom of the social order within the South, because of everything that we talked about, in producing large amounts of agriculture, especially cotton, which is a very labor intensive crop, it will rely on the work of enslaved labor. We're going to talk more about the intricacies about African slavery here in just a moment, but you would see slaves, which was solely a race based system. African slaves would be at the bottom of the social order, and you'd also see that there would be another class in Southern society that often does not get talked about. There is a sizable population of free African Americans living in the South, even in the days leading up to the U.S. Civil War. Now, I do want to point out in regards to our estimates on how big this population is, they can't be entirely accurate because, in regards to much of the free black population living in the South, they'd be considered, and this is a term from the time, so I know it's outdated, but this is a term. I'm only using this from a historical standpoint. They were referred to as mulattoes. Mulattoes essentially was somebody of mixed ancestry. And in many cases, and we'll talk about the widespread rape within the institution of slavery, typically this is where you would have, say, a white father and then a black mother. And why I'm bringing this up is because you will see that many a part of this class, of this group, um, over time, you will start to see that they will either have a very light skin complexion in many cases, and because of that, they can pass off as white in Southern society. And so we're not entirely sure how large this population actually is, but free blacks, nonetheless, living predominantly in cities that we see in the American South, virtually no rights. We talked about before, cannot vote. They're not going to have really any rights for property ownership. And you'll see even in the days before the Civil War, Virginia comes to mind in particular, you'll see that there will be laws that would be established basically stating if you're a free black, you can't live here. You would kick them out prior to the not right at the outset of the Civil War, but in the years leading up to it. And so we do see this as a portion of this class, but nonetheless, they're going to have virtually the same rights as you see with African American slaves. And we'll talk more about that as we get to the institution of slavery here in a minute. But anyways, we've talked about Southern society at the outbreak of the Civil War, and it's important for us to talk about Northern society. Now, looking at Northern society, it's going to be broken up into very different class groups because, as I mentioned before, while agriculture does play a pretty significant part in Northern society before the Civil War, you do start to see the emergence of industry, of manufacturing, which is going to change the social order, and it'll look drastically different than what we have just described within the South. Now, first, you do have at the top of the social order an upper class, very similar to what you'd see in the South. But rather than having these large plantation owners producing cotton, they're going to be predominantly entrepreneurs, they're going to be industrialists, with the exception of a few large landowners. Now, the industrialists in particular are going to dominate the upper class, and in due time, they're going to control much of the GDP that we see not only coming into the northern economy, but also into the United States as a whole. And this industrialist class, and I'm going to talk about the working class here in a second as well, will begin to increase during this period as we see manufacturing, as we see industrialization, and so forth. And so that's where we see this drastically different society begin to develop. The middle class, similarly, because of industrialization, will look different from those farmers we had talked about in the South. Now, you do, once again, have farmers. I think it's important for us to recognize at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, North and South, the majority of people still lived on farms, still would consider themselves farmers. That was their profession. However, increasingly in the years before the Civil War, you see the emergence of this middle class that would be increasingly focused on industrial issues. They will start to have, or I should say, industrial professions. You'll start to see skilled artisans. You'll start to see other professionals be a part of this middle class, whether it's doctors, lawyers, and so forth. And you could go on with this list, but anyways, these are essentially going to be skilled laborers that would make up the middle class. At the bottom of the social order, you'll have the working class. These are largely going to be unskilled laborers who begin to work for wages, and this is the phenomenon we see develop before this period. Um, with a working class, typically you're going to see that a large number of these individuals are going to be immigrants coming from Ireland or Germany initially during this period. Also included in this class, any free African Americans you might have in the North might be included in this class, and so forth. But what you will notice about Northern society, where it's drastically different than what we talked about in Southern society, is the lack of an enslaved class. By this point, as we get into the years specifically after the War of 1812, all of the northern states have abolished slavery. That wasn't the case at the beginning of the conflict, but anyways, or at the beginning of the century. But anyways, you do see that slavery was abolished throughout all these states by this point. And just from our description of Northern and Southern society, we see that their social structures are completely different. They rely on different ideals. They begin to develop different cultures as a result of this, especially the North. We see that they would become a much more urbanized society compared to the agricultural society that we see in the American South. However, even though we've talked a lot about their differences, one thing I always like to stress is the similarities between Northern and Southern society, because it's easy for us to forget about these similarities. First, I do want to talk about in regards to the issue of race. Race is a paramount issue for both Southerners and Northerners. This is something I often talk about in my history classes. We often pick on the American South because of slavery, because of the Jim Crow laws, and so forth. But it's important for us to recognize that Northerners, especially during the Civil War, when I make the argument that they're fighting for the end of slavery, they're not necessarily pro-slave, if this makes sense. They're not looking to advance on African American rights. Especially with this working class in particular, you will see that there will be a lot of racial sentiments, so a lot of racially charged language being promoted from the working class, especially from immigrant groups. They see African Americans in bondage in the South, that if they are free, they too would become competition for the factories and the jobs that we see opening up as a result of the market revolution. And so, very much so, you'll see that same racially charged sentiment that it's amongst white Southerners would be amongst white Northerners. You see this carry on into the U.S. Civil War, and it's why you'll see at first most Northerners are going to be very hesitant to support the idea of emancipation, support the idea of having black troops fight out in combat, and so on and so forth. And you do see segregation begins to take place in Northern society. I mean, a good example of this that we'll talk about next week when we talk about the soldiers' experience in the Civil War, the U.S. Armed Services will be racially segregated. We'll see all white units and all black units. They couldn't even serve side by side. And so it's important for us to recognize those similarities in racial feeling. Likewise, other similarities. It's important for us to understand that Southerners and Northerners have undergone many of the same experiences. They have the same mythology in regards to the founding generation, but they're going to look at the founding generation in very different ways whenever they're advocating for their cause during the Civil War and so forth. But, anyways, once again, that's a topic that we may be able to touch on a little bit more in the future. But anyways, now that we've gone through the differing economies, the different societies that develop, I want to talk about the larger issue of slavery, which becomes more of a paramount issue as we begin to approach the US Civil War and eventually would lead to the direct causation of that conflict. And so it's important for us to understand first the views Americans, North and South, have on the institution of slavery, how they're changing as we build up to the US Civil War, and then talk about the institution of slavery itself for those individuals, for what all was at stake for those individuals who were suffering as a result of this institution. Now, the debate over the morality of slavery is nothing new to the US by the time of the Civil War. It's an ongoing debate that we could trace back even to the founding of the Republic. If you go back to the Constitutional Convention, this is something I often promote in my US history classes. One of the biggest divisive issues that we see confront the Constitutional Convention would be the issue of slavery. James Madison would document this as such, and it threatened to basically break apart the American Union at that point. However, in the end, they make the three-fifths compromise, which read up on that in your own time, to avoid that institution, or to avoid debate surrounding that institution. Now, with that said, really from the Constitutional Convention onward, you're going to see that American politicians are going to try to delay addressing that topic, really leave it for future generations to discuss. And because of that very issue, that's what's going to eventually lead it to explode by the time we get to the US Civil War. Now, I do want to point out, what were the founding fathers? What were their views on this institution? Why did they accept it? Now, the founding fathers generation, I'm going to largely point out the slave owners that we see. The majority or a large number of founding fathers, North and South, did in some fashion own slaves. I do want to point out, even when we are talking about the American Revolution, by the end of that conflict and by the Constitutional Convention, only one state had abolished slavery, and that was the state of Massachusetts. But the question is, what does the George Washingtons, the Thomas Jeffersons, what do they view about slavery? Now, both Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, as well as many other Southerners, I might add, because they would fall into that class, they viewed slavery as an abomination, but they called it what they dubbed as a necessary evil. Now, I'm going to point out Thomas Jefferson in particular because he has very controversial views towards the issue of slavery, because he truly does practice this idea that slavery was a necessary evil. Throughout his life, he does promote a large number of letters, writings, even pieces of legislature that would promote some anti slavery sentiments. Even if you go back right before the American Revolution, he proposed to the House of Burgesses, if I remember correctly, an anti slavery bill, basically calling for the abolition of slavery. It would ultimately be rejected by their society, but nonetheless, it was a paramount issue to Thomas Jefferson. And likewise, if you look at many of his writings throughout his life, he does condemn the institution, calling it an abomination. But he sees it as a necessary evil. He believes that there is no real solution to the end of slavery. And also, it adds his contradictory views because he's not willing to end slavery under his own hand. He actually owns over 600 slaves at his plantation at Monticello. But many other founding fathers would have that same kind of philosophy, that slavery was a necessary evil. They believed it was a dying institution. And over time, you would eventually see slavery evaporate and die on its own, have a natural death. However, that doesn't happen. By the mid 1800s, in the decades leading up to the US Civil War, the debate that many Americans thought they agreed on, saying that slavery was a necessary evil and that it eventually would slowly die out across the Union, that wasn't the case at all. we start to see that slavery begins to expand, it begins to thrive. And there will be several reasons for this, but a big reason will be because of a change in the or in the Southern psyche. And as we talked about with individuals like Thomas Jefferson, a Southerner, a plantation owner, he called it a necessary evil. But now, with a new generation of politicians, most notably led by the likes of South Carolinian John C. Calhoun, he would view the institution as a positive good because it had benefited both Northern and Southern economies, because it helped fuel American capitalism and helped fuel the emerging America as an emerging world slash commercial power. And as he begins to develop with that sort of rhetoric, you will see that there would be a great amount of pushback against that sort of rhetoric. You will start to see by the 1820s and 1830s, now that slavery hasn't come to an end, there'd be a number of anti-slavery movements, and you start to see more radicals known as the abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison, would view slavery as an abomination. And the only way to cure America of this sin was to immediately, not gradually end the institution, not send the African Americans over to Africa to Liberia and a colony that the American Colonization Society was advocating for, but bring about an immediate end to slavery, live up to the American creed, all men are created equal, and give civil rights to African Americans. And now that's for the more radical abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, but you start to see that these two polar opposite viewpoints begin to emerge. And these individuals, I do want to point out the fire eating Southerners like Calhoun, the William Lloyd Garrisons of the world, the abolitionists, they probably represent a very small minority of the population. We already talked about the plantation owners who very much benefited greatly from the institution of slavery. They only make up a small portion of Southern society. Abolitionists, even though they were an extremely loud movement in pursuing the goal of abolition, only 2% of Northerners would ever support the abolitionist movement by the time we get to the outbreak of the Civil War. But what's crucial about their differing viewpoints is because with many major issues, especially surrounding the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, it guarantees that this debate would be heated, and it guarantees that this debate would not go away anytime soon until the issue is resolved. And that's what will eventually lead us down the road to the Civil War, were these debates, and specifically centering around what should happen in regards to the Western territories, which we'll come to here in a second. But as we talked about these views on slavery, I do want to switch our attention to the impact it has on those who actually lived this experience. And I want to talk about the reality of slavery in the South, because we will talk about some of these individuals that were a part of the system of bondage eventually join up and fight for the Union Army. We're going to see what that will mean for them, what they will be fighting for during their experience in the Union Army. Now, due to the expansion of slavery, which I want to point out why many Southerners begin to view it as a positive good, will be because of the cotton gin, because it does make cotton extremely lucrative as a result. Because of the expansion of slavery, by the time we get to the outbreak of the Civil War, as I already mentioned, about 4 million individuals are going to live, or 4 million individuals are going to be in the system of bondage. Now, the type of slavery that would be practiced in the American South, even before this period, would be chattel slavery. These individuals, men, women, children, all African Americans that were in the system of bondage would be treated not as human beings, but rather they'd be treated as beasts of burdens, they would be treated as animals, and they would be viewed by their societies as property, not as people. And that's crucial because they believe that you can't expand rights to citizenship, rights to voting, so forth, to somebody they didn't even consider human. Also, what's characteristic about slavery in the South? As I mentioned earlier, it's going to be solely race-based. You're not going to see white slaves. You're not going to see any other race besides African slaves in the South. And also, slavery was permanent and it was hereditary. Now, if you look at it and compare it to other forms of slavery that's been practiced throughout world history, one, slavery is nothing unique to the American South. I mean, it had been introduced by the English and introduced by the European powers before then. And so it's nothing unique to the American South. However, unlike forms of slavery that had existed before colonization, like let's say slavery in the Roman Empire or slavery in the ancient world, those systems weren't necessarily always permanent, and they definitely weren't hereditary. meaning that it wouldn't carry on over time. If you have a enslaved family, if they have kids, they would effectively become slave and property of their masters, and this creates slave breeding that you'll see prevalent throughout the American South. And it's no surprise that they would put a lot of plantation owners would put a lot of money into purchasing enslaved women. But also as a part of the system, because it was hereditary and it was permanent, since they consider them these individuals property, they actively sold these individuals. Families meant nothing to them. There was no legal binding through marriages amongst the enslaved population, and you actively see through the auction block that these individuals would be them and their families would be completely broken apart. Now, also, I do want to talk about in regards to the lives of the slaves, as I've talked about their humanity being stripped from them. This will be because of the slave codes that we see present in each state. Their lives would be completely regulated. Oftentimes, they'd be overseen by a white overseer. We'd also see that it would be illegal for slaves to read or write. They could not have, as I mentioned before, the same legal standings in regards to marriage, which makes it easy to rip their families apart. And once again, the slave codes are going to treat them as beasts of burden, as property that many white Southerners viewed as no different from an inanimate object that they may purchase at market as well. And so that is the very brutal reality that we see of slavery. But to make it even more brutal, let's talk about the experience for those. Now, many of y'all are probably familiar with the dark aspects of slavery, especially in regards to beatings that slaves would have, and if they failed to do whatever their master may demand of them. And we see this most notably from an image that's produced during the 1850s, which would horrify the American public. And I'll come back to this here in a second. But I want to go back to this image. We also see that as a part of the reality of slavery, especially for enslaved women, for black women living in the institution of slavery. Since they were considered property, actively you would see that rape would be widespread in this institution. I talked about the mulatto class that had formed at the bottom of Southern society. It will be because of the widespread rape that we see in Southern society of black women because of slavery. And this is very much depicted in this contemporary image of the time that talks about the Virginian luxuries, about how, and this is an abolitionist piece of imagery, talks about the brutal whippings that African American men have to endure, as well as the what we see slave owners do to enslaved women. But anyways, this was the brutal realities that African Americans were confronting. And so I want to go back to what was happening on the plantations, especially in regards to this image. Now, this is what's unique about really talking about this period is photographs like the one that we're viewing here. This is a radically new media for people living at the time. I mean, the photograph, as we know it, was comes into introduction in 1838. That's the first recorded photograph. There were some precursors to it, but 1838 is the date we're going to use. And after that, you see this as photographs as well as daguerreotypes become widely popular. And images have a very powerful response to them. Now, many of y'all have probably seen this image of an enslaved man that has been brutally beaten as a result of his time in slavery. And so, I mean, I hate to use the term, but we've really been desensitized to images like this one. They don't have the same impact that they would have had in their own time. And abolitionists are going to be masters at producing images like this and circulating it around the United States. And this is going to generate a great amount of outpour and a great amount of anger as a result. Now, they won't necessarily view African Americans as equals because of viewing this image, but this will bring to many Northerners who really didn't quite understand what slavery looked like, bring the brutal realities of slavery to their firesides. And so, photography is going to be a crucial new medium that we're going to discuss in more detail, especially by the time we get to the Civil War, because it's going to be very important in how Americans view the conflict as well. But we see this early on in the debates of slavery. This would be adopted by the abolitionist movement and generate outrage over the actions that we see in the South. But I do want to point out this won't be the only art form that's going to be used to try to promote the sentiment. We'll talk about that a little bit later on with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. But anyways, we do see the brutal realities that African Americans were facing in the institution of slavery. And we're going to come back to their roles in the Civil War. And you can see what was very much at stake for them in the Civil War, as well as the period there afterwards. And so we'll come back to that point later on. But anyways, as we've talked about really society, what it looks like for all groups of Americans, white, black, and so forth, I do want to talk about some other themes that we've also addressed as we've gone throughout these various classes. I want to talk about religion within the United States in the build up to the Civil War because religion is extremely vital to American society at the beginning of the Civil War, as well as promoting many of the reforms that are going to actually bring this issue of slavery to light and lead to those debates that would eventually once again bring us down the road to Civil War. Now, in terms of religion, America was heavily religious. And a large reason for this is because they undergo a phenomenon known as the Second Great Awakening. Now, because of the effects of the market revolution in particular, as well as urbanization, we start to see that in American cities, crime was on the rise, as well as we see church memberships were beginning to plummet. And throughout the first several decades of the 1800s, America is going to witness a series of intense religious revivals that's going to promote emotionalism to bring people to the church to try to create a more perfect society. Now, the religious revivals are collectively known as the Second Great Awakening. You'll see the emergence as well as the expansion of a number of Protestant groups that we're very familiar with here living in the US. Groups like the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and several others are going to emerge as a result of these religious revivals. They're going to be promoting hellfire sermons to where these various ministers are going to basically say your soul's damned to hell unless you convert over to Christianity. And that's going to be very powerful, especially for some of these urbanized societies, because what will be preached by these ministers is a more open faith. It doesn't matter what your class is, your position in society, what you have done in life. If you repent of your sins, you would be seen as, or well, one, you were seen as equal before God. But if you repent your sins, you could be forgiven. And if everybody was seen as equally before God, if they were seen as not only equal, but they were have the same they're viewed as equal before God. This has a very powerful impact on American society. And you'll start to see this with the abolitionist movement, which would be made up of many ministers early on, even Frederick Douglass himself, who will be a black leader within the abolitionist movement. He's going to rely on much of he was an ordained minister, and he's going to be heavily religious in pursuing that goal of achieving freedom for African Americans and later civil rights. And so religion will be vital in that aspect. But also, I want to go back to the core reason to why we see these religious revivals. They're trying to change American society, make it more Christian, but make it more perfect in their eyes. And this will lead to a number of reform movements that will emerge during this period that will be inspired by religion. Now, some of these reform movements, like temperance, are going to be things that will be universal North and South. That would be adopted by many Northerners and Southerners. However, other issues, especially concerning the issue of abolition, which we'll circle back to, this is going to be adopted mainly by Northerners as opposed to Southerners. But anyways, I mean, taking a look at this movement, I want to focus first on the temperance movement. Now, temperance, this is where we'll see they'll advocate really for either limiting or outright banning the sale and purchase of alcohol because they viewed alcohol as the root of all evil. Now, to be fair, in regards to the temperance movement, they were drawing many of their arguments based off of the rising crime that we see within American cities. And they believed that alcohol was the root of that crime, as is demonstrated in this pamphlet. And I'll circle back around to this pamphlet here in a second. But, anyways, I do want to point out there is some, perhaps, foundation in this. Because if you look at Americans during this period, they do drink 3 times the amount of alcohol that their modern day counterpart drinks today. So, in other words, I mean, I could use other statistics. They were just a lot more drunk people walking around. Drinking was America's favorite institution. Most Americans, North, South, engaged in drinking at inns, taverns, and so forth. But why that matters to us is because they believe that this contributed to widespread crime. And if you could get rid of the drinking of alcohol, then perhaps you could get rid of most crime, if not all crime. And so you start to see the temperance movement begin to emerge by the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, dedicated to this mission of establishing dry laws to eliminate alcohol. And we see the message that they're promoting to the American people through this image. Now, usually I talk about this image in my history classes for the significance of the message that they're promoting. But I want to focus on this pamphlet in another means. As I mentioned before, artwork isn't going to be heavily produced during this period or influential by American society. Or I shouldn't say that. Artwork is just not going to be in its, I guess, highest form for American society during this period. but rather where Americans are going to come into contact with a lot of the artwork of this period will be in those engravings I talked about, as well as these pamphlets that are going to be produced by these various reform movements. And this pamphlet, this really piece of propaganda promoting the particular idea of temperance, is extremely powerful. If you look over on the image on the left, it shows you what happens if you accept the sin of alcohol, which we see depicted right in the center. It talks about misery, poverty, and so forth that follows with it. Whereas if you compare it to the image on the right, health, basically a fertile tree prosperity happens if you don't adopt alcohol. And this is a very powerful piece of propaganda that does impact many Americans' minds. I mean, there's going to be a large number of Americans that are going to give up drinking, that are going to adopt temperance, and once again, both North as well as South. If you look at William Lloyd Garrison, he was a leading abolitionist. He would also be supportive of most of the reform movements, including temperance, during this period. Likewise, if we go south, I'm going to point out another Confederate general that I've done some research on, that of Jeb Stuart. He'd be a cavalry, well, I should say the leading cavalry general in the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. And he would be a supporter of the temperance movement. His mother would also be a supporter of the temperance movement. And so this is a phenomenon that develops both North and South. But what's significant about this reform movement is the distribution of these pamphlets, because you will see imagery like this that's being drawn out and sent out to the American people. These very same pamphlets would be applied to other reform movements that we see. You will see a prison reform movement that would develop during this period. Women's rights would develop during this period, as well as the abolitionist movement. And all of those movements are going to use these pamphlets to try to influence Americans at the ballot box to impact their society. Some will be successful, some won't. If you look at the abolitionist movement in 1830, I believe 1836, you'll see that abolitionists are going to send out these pamphlets to the American South. They will be rejected, and you'll actually see that the white Southerners are going to call on the federal government to censor the U.S. Postal Service because of this. And this is going to lead to issues in Congress, but nonetheless, you do see how these pamphlets were vital for spreading these various messages. And they'll play a very important role in really helping that abolitionist movement continue to be pushed forth, continue to advocate in order to bring about that social change, and eventually, once again, lead us down the road to civil war. Now, the last topic I do want to discuss that will actually be more instrumental in leading us to the Civil War than this pamphlet campaign will be the issue of westward expansion, which I'll come back to this guy here in a second. Now, westward expansion. By the end of the War of 1812, it's going to rapidly accelerate. I mean, Americans, even before the end of the War of 1812, they had been interested and viewed the West in a very romantic light. Essentially, if you had failed in life in the East, and say the original 13 colonies, if you went out to the Western territories, there was an opportunity for you to get new land, to make something new of yourself, and with it, really revitalize your social positioning. And so there's been this long tradition by Americans to go out west, to conquer the West in order to have these new opportunities. However, the frontier for Americans consistently changes. For Americans following the American Revolution, the frontier would be only a few hundred miles inland, whereas for the Americans of our period, the western frontier would be places like Texas, places like Kansas, Nebraska, even going out into the far west, New Mexico, and so on and so forth. But as you start to see Americans spread to the frontier, seeking those new opportunities, and I should point out, for many Americans are also trying to escape debt that's caused by financial panics during this period, the issue of slavery is also going to expand west. Now, we see that really around the issue of slavery and expansion into the Western territories, the Union almost breaks itself apart on several occasions. The first time that this becomes a central debate, and it really inaugurates this period that would be dominated by sectional feeling, would be the Missouri Compromise. Now, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, in a nutshell, this is where you'll see Missouri enter the Union as a slave state, but it establishes a 3630 line, which basically states along this 3630 line, which is the southern border of Missouri, everything north of that line was closed off to slavery. Everything south of that line, slavery could expand to. Now, for those who established the Missouri Compromise, the Henry Clays, the James Monroes, and so forth, they believed that this compromise really had solved this issue once and for all. However, that's not the case. As you get into the years specifically after the Mexican-American War, the U.S. had acquired basically twice the amount of territory it had prior to the beginning of the conflict. They acquire all the rights to Texas, New Mexico, California, parts of Oregon, so forth through that conflict as well as other events. And now the debates are renewed. Many Southerners want slavery to expand there. Northerners do not. California tries to enter as a free state. Southerners try to block its entrance. Another compromise is made to try to ensure that this issue wouldn't blow up in their faces and lead to a civil war. Well, the compromise that they established in the Compromise of 1850 doesn't lead to lasting peace. What it's going to eventually, inevitably lead to was bitter sentiment. It's going to lead to an idea known as popular sovereignty, which would call for democracy to be practiced in action to vote on who or whether or not a state or territory would adopt or reject slavery. And because of those debates, because of things that happen surrounding whether or not slavery should expand into the territories, that will lead us directly down the road to the Civil War. And so I did want to highlight that because that will be extremely instrumental once we do get to the Civil War, because many Southern states were fearful that they would eventually become outnumbered in the Senate. You might see the northern states begin to promote their interests and eventually lead to the abolition of slavery. So that's what their fear was, that there would be too many free states entered to the Union, too much representation, and so forth. But anyways, we'll talk more about those issues in the future. But now I want to turn to some other themes. Now, throughout all of our lectures that we've had this semester, we've talked about the importance of the arts and as well as literature in American society, or I shouldn't say American society, in these various societies building up to those events that we've discussed. And in this case, the importance of literature will be vital to the American people in our build up to the Civil War, because it's going to ensure many of those debates that were centering around slavery's expansion into the territories, the issue of slavery and the morality of slavery weren't going away anytime soon. Now, first, America prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, during the 1830s and the 1840s, will witness its first truly literary movement and what's known as the Transcendentalist movement. Now, this movement will be led by individuals like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's really going to kickstart this movement, but also the guy you see up here on the board, that of Henry David Thoreau. And through the literary tradition, they're really going to continue ideas that were being promoted in the Romantic tradition that we talked about over in Europe. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson, initially he wanted to be, if I remember correctly, a minister, basically fails at that, and he'll go over to Europe on basically a tour. As he's over in Europe, he's going to encounter many romantic writers, artists, and so forth. He's going to take the same ideas that was being promoted amongst the romantics, basically saying that there's more to life than just logic and reason, that there are other ideals that transcend this. And he comes back home with these ideals, and that's going to impact American literature. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson, based out of Concord, he's going to lead the Transcendentalists, and you could talk about Brook Farm and some of the other groups that would be associated with the Transcendentalists, but I really want to focus on his protege, Henry David Thoreau. Now, Henry David Thoreau, as well as Ralph Waldo Emerson, are going to produce a large number of works during their life, essays, many of which, hopefully, in some classrooms across the country, are still read today. And Henry David Thoreau, as well as Emerson, are going to be major critics of the of slavery in the American South. You will see that they're going to be heavily opposed to it, and Henry David Thoreau and himself in particular would be opposed. Oh, and I don't have the I apologize for that, folks. I don't have his excerpt here on the board, but he would be heavily opposed to the U.S.'s action in the Mexican-American War, really viewing it as the slaveholding empire's expansion out of those territories to expand the institution of slavery. And in response to this conflict, he would publish one of his most famous essays, that is Civil Disobedience. Now, you can read Civil Disobedience. It is in the lecture slides that are posted on D2L, but I'm going to go ahead and read through this excerpt, and we'll talk about it for just a second. But coming from Civil Disobedience, what he writes is, if the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go. Let it go. Frictionless it will wear smooth. Certainly, the machine will wear out. If the injustice has a spring or a pulley or a rope or a crank exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. Now, in this, what he's promoting is the idea of civil disobedience. He's basically promoting that if there's a law that is extremely unjust, he's particularly referring to some of the slave, or I shouldn't say the slavery laws at this time, but he's promoting some of the laws that were being passed in the light of the Mexican American War. He's basically advocating for civil disobedience. He doesn't advocate for outright agitation. He isn't fiery like John Brown, who's one of the leading abolitionists that would look to lead a slave revolt amongst Southern slaves. But he's calling for civil disobedience, for peaceful protest. And his work, I mean, it doesn't have a great amount of influence in this time. It does demonstrate to us how there are a lot of Americans that were opposed to slavery, but it will be influential in a future generation. I always point this out in my U.S. history classes. For many of the protesters in the civil rights movement, they will be reading works done by Henry David Thoreau, most notably Civil Disobedience. And if you're familiar with Martin Luther King and his protest styles, he would advocate for civil disobedience, really being a very much influenced by Henry David Thoreau. Now, there will be other transcendentalist writers that would be influenced, but there is one piece of literature that I do want to discuss that will be extremely vital for really the abolitionist movement. Now, one, Henry David Thoreau, not very well read in his own time, but a work that will be widely read that would advocate against slavery and really convince many Northerners that something had to be done about this institution and that it was a morally unjust institution, and bring it into their firesides, into their homes, to try to understand what was happening in this institution, will be that of the leading abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe when she publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin, I'm not going to go into too much detail of what's described in it, but Harriet Beecher Stowe, first, where she gets her inspiration for this work is she's going to rely on a number of autobiographies produced by former slaves, as well as conduct her own interviews. And she will create a fictitious account that will center around a character by the name of Uncle Tom that goes on to save the life of a little white girl named Ava. But anyways, it through this story, what it does depict is the horrid realities of slavery that she got from those autobiographies. And when it's published, somewhere in the neighborhood, well, first, the first edition of the Uncle Tom's Cabin would sell out. But over 250,000 of these books are going to be sold in the US. And over 1 million books are going to be sold in places like England and France. It's a very powerful weapon depicting the brutal realities of slavery, something that slave owners had often denied to white Northerners throughout much of this period. And it's going to really convince Americans that something needed to be done about this issue of slavery. And if you look at the political atmosphere in the 1850s, slavery isn't going anywhere anytime fast. It increasingly becomes an issue, and you'll see that it would become even an issue on some of the presidential campaigns. But anyways, with that said, it was a very powerful piece of literature that began to really shape the abolitionist movement, weaponized it, and eventually lead us down the road to civil war. And so literature has a very important role, especially in shaping Northern attitudes, even though they may not advocate for full equality, but shaping their attitudes towards adopting some sort of notions of an anti-slavery movement. But anyways, we'll talk about how much those attitudes were impacted by the time we get to the Civil War. But anyways, I guess one last fact I should have mentioned when I've talked about the copy is to demonstrate how powerful this piece of literature is and how widespread it was read. During the 19th century in the U.S., only one other book will outsell it, and it'll be the Bible. So that should tell you how powerful and how widespread this book would ultimately become. But anyways, there's one last topic that I do want to address in regards to this antebellum period of what we've been discussing. And I actually want to focus on soldiering in the pre-war army before the Civil War, because the soldier's experience in the pre-war army is going to look drastically different than what we'll talk about in the U.S. Civil War. Now, first, I want to point out Americans believe in this idea of the citizen soldier tradition. Basically, in times of war, that's when you would see the citizens of a country would take up the roles as soldiers, fight to defend their country, and when the war comes to an end, they return back to their civilian practices, whether it's being a farmer, whether it was working in a factory, and so on and so forth. Now, why is this important? Well, it's because the citizen soldier tradition that comes into being was shaped because of America's experience during the Revolutionary period, where you saw British soldiers occupying American cities. And for many Americans, and I should point out, even those living over in Europe, They viewed that a large standing army was basically a tool for tyranny. And so this demonstrates to us how American society is drastically different. Is the U.S. military was extremely small during the antebellum years. Now, immediately after the American Revolution, if we look at the U.S. Army between the end of the Revolution and the beginning of the Adams administration by the late 1790s, the American Army at points numbered no more than 300 men in some cases. However, it will increase over time. But the U.S. Army in the buildup to the Civil War would only number, I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but it was only, I believe, 12,000 sticking out there, but it was only 12, maybe 15,000 soldiers fighting in the Army. So it was extremely small. It was just barely enough to defend the frontier, to defend, or basically to police the U.S., if you will, and so forth. So it wasn't a large army. Now, with this said, with the citizen soldier tradition that is established, I do want to point out those who do join the U.S. military during this period are going to have a drastically different experience than those who would join the military during the Civil War, when we see over 3 million servicemen join both armies during the Civil War. First, Americans have a very negative view on the army. One, we had talked about how they viewed the army as potentially a tool for tyranny, but also how they're going to have a very negative view on the army will be in two other regards. First, they basically viewed those who had joined the army as scum, and the reason that they had joined the army in the first place was because they couldn't do anything with their lives. They viewed them as lazy, they viewed them as non productive members of their society, and as a result, they would view them basically as lesser than some of those lower classes we had described. So they don't have a very high view for them. On top of that, I also want to point out, especially in the 1840s, and this is more of something that I address once I get to the Mexican American War. But you also see a large number of immigrants are going to turn over to the U.S. military. What's important for us to recognize as the nation begins to industrialize, if you're an individual, not only immigrants, but if you were an individual living in American society, living in a city, you lost your job, there was no other prospect for economic advancement. The U.S. Army does present a pretty good image because you get paid, you would have some form of shelter. Perhaps you could go out on an adventure, and two, you could be in the military for a long period of time. And so, for many Americans, mostly immigrants during this period that had no other economic opportunities, the army seemed to be a safe bet. But there will be a lot of negative native issues that come with it. Now, during the Mexican American War, or a large portion of the U.S. regular troops, these are soldiers who enlisted in the military long before the conflict. They were career soldiers. They would see a great amount of nativism applied towards them. You'll actually see that many Irish troops who hadn't been living in the U.S. for relatively long, that had joined the U.S. military, actually would defect over to the Mexican army during the course of Scott's campaign towards Mexico City. But it demonstrates to us the very negative perceptions Americans have on military service outside of times of war. However, that will change as we see Americans enter the service during the U.S. Civil War. Now, this is a great picture I do want to point out, and I use it just to represent for y'all on the screen soldiers in the pre-war army. This is actually an image produced by the Mexican American War, but it demonstrates to us how photographs were increasingly coming into being. And we'll talk about these especially once we get to, once again, to the Civil War. But anyways, for American perceptions on military service, this will impact many American servicemen when they do enlist. Now, for regular soldiers with this small professional army, you want them to be disciplined, you want them to be able to stand up in battle, and so forth. Well, the U.S. Army that we'll see in the Civil War, many Americans are unwilling to subjugate themselves to this discipline. They're unwilling to become soldiers. Think about it today as somebody joined the military not wanting to go through boot camp, but call themselves a U.S. Marine, a U.S. Soldier, and so on and so forth. That's essentially what Americans at the Civil War were trying to do. But anyways, they're also going to try to do things like electing their own officers and so forth. And we're going to talk about how volunteer troops are going to be drastically different from these regular troops. Now, also in regards to soldiering in the pre-war army, I do want to point out the officer corps really quickly. They're going to be made up of strictly West Point graduates. There will be some non-West Point graduates, but for the most part, they'll be graduates of West Point. And many of those that fought in the Mexican-American War that would be commanding volunteers and later commanding soldiers in the Civil War, you will see that they will take on prominent positions. But anyways, we'll talk more about them later on. But anyways, that pretty much brings us to an end of our discussion over American society in the 1800s. I know this has been a longish video. I believe it's been almost an hour and a half, maybe it looks like maybe a little less. But anyways, with that said, before we go ahead and wrap up this video, just make sure that you're reviewing all materials from this week. Make sure that you're watching all videos. And if you do have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.